Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Michael Sanchez, and I'm the president of the Cambridge University Social Impact and Sustainability Society. Our topic today is Fixing Capitalism, Purposeful Governance. This session is recorded and will be placed in our YouTube channel. There will be a question and answer at the end of the presentation, so please raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask the question. We are honored today to have a distinguished speaker whose contributions to the field of management, economics, and corporate governance are truly exceptional. Colin Mayer is Emeritus Professor of Management Studies at Saïd Business School and visiting professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. His academic achievements and contributions have earned him fellowship in the British Academy, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the European Corporate Governance Institute. Furthermore, he holds the esteemed titles of Emeritus Fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, and Honorary Fellow of both Oriel College and St. Anne's College, Oxford. In recognition to his services, Professor Mayer was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2017. His thought leadership is further exemplified by his role in leading the British Academy enquiry into the future of corporation. For more than a decade, Professor Mayer has been a constant voice about responsible businesses and good governance, even long before ESG became popular. Part of his work is a trilogy of books that explore the problems of capitalism. The first book is Firm Commitment: Why the Corporation is Failing Us and How to Restore It, states the problem of capitalism. The second book, entitled Prosperity: Better Businesses Makes the Greater Good, explores the solution to that problem of capitalism that he stated. The third book, Capitalism and Crisis: How to Fix Them, discusses the transformation, what fundamental change we need in our capitalist system to fix it, and how do businesses transform from a point of lack of trust and commitment to having a clear North Star purpose. Professor Mayer has pointed out that the problem of the capitalist system is the absence of trust and commitment. And this partly stems from the Friedman Doctrine, which started in 1960, which states that there is only one social purpose of business, and that is to acquire and increase profit as long as it is within the bounds of the game. And it is the role of business leaders to maximize profit as much as possible. The multitude of crises we have in our capitalist societies right now, such as the environmental degradation, social inequality, and social unrest, have stemmed from these flawed beliefs. And these crises will increase in numbers and grow in magnitude unless we embark on this urgent and much-needed transformation. Today, we have Professor Colin Mayer to give us more insights about this topic. He will be interviewed by Dr. Yoko Fiole, who is the Director of Governance of the Cambridge University Social Impact and Sustainability Society, Managing Partner of Alpha Governance Partners, International Fiduciary Services Company, and Adjunct Professor of Finance Ethics at the University of Neuchâtel, and he's also a Cambridge alumni. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Colin Mayer and Dr. Yoko Fiole.
Thank you so much, Michael, and Colin. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. It's wonderful that you make time to discuss important concepts of your latest book, which I have here. Hopefully people can see it, almost 300 pages. And when you and I had the preparation call, I said that it almost reads like a pamphlet, a call to action almost, although it's obviously founded in many years of academic research and across disciplines, in fact. So I found that illuminating and fantastic at the same time. We have around 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. And we also have a bit of a flow of topics to discuss. And I'd like to start, Colin, if you may, with the first topic that's sort of the base, I think, of the book. And I think Michael also just alluded to it. We have a trust problem in society. Can you elucidate a little bit on that first notion, on that trust problem?
Yes, and first of all, thank you very much indeed, Michael and Yoko, for the invitation to contribute to this. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. As you said, the book is really a call to action. And that's because I think it's time for action. We've had a lot of words and good expressions over the last 2 years, but we're still lacking action. And things in many respects are getting worse, not better. And at the heart of that is a trust problem in society. There's a serious trust problem in our institutions as a whole, and declining trust in many areas, not only in relation to business, but also in particular in relation to governments around the world. And at the heart of that trust problem is a failure of business in particular, really to recognize what people are looking for from business. And to give you an illustration of that trust problem, every year for the past 40 years, Ipso Mori, the market research company, has undertaken a survey of which professions in Britain people trust to tell the truth. And near the bottom, just ahead of estate agents, journalists, and advertising executives, and as you can guess, rock bottom come politicians. Just ahead of those come business leaders. They come below bankers, they come below trade union officials, they come below what's termed the man and the woman in the street. And that is a reflection of a sense that business does not reflect our interests. It's in there for the money. And being in there for the money does not mean, as some basic economic models might suggest it does, that they're then in it for us as individuals, societies, and the natural world. And that's extremely damaging for business, let alone for us as customers, employees, suppliers, communities, etc. And addressing it is absolutely essential for business to flourish as well as the rest.
That's an interesting. So if I understand you correctly, we're not looking at just business, but we're looking at the connection between business and society. And I think in your book, you also sort of choose, as a result almost maybe, a systems approach. Now, if I'm correctly informed, I think you're originally trained as an engineer. Can you speak a little bit about that systems approach and why this is relevant in addressing these topics?
It's highly relevant and it's highly complex because business was set up as a very private institution with freedom of incorporation in the 19th century. What happened is that business was free to set itself up without having to get licenses and charters from governments and monarchs around the world to create businesses, to do what they thought were appropriate. And they were set up by investors and owners that were seeking to earn commercial returns from their investments. So the way in which we view business in terms of the way in which it's legally structured is as a private entity. And corporate law and company law is regarded as being part of private law. But then these businesses have grown since they started in the middle of the 19th century from being relatively small family-owned businesses into mega multinational corporations. And it's frequently said that many of them are bigger than certain nation states. Now, the implication of that is that although it might be legally set up as a private entity, it's an incredibly public entity in terms of the impact that it has on societies, on the environment and the natural world, and in particular, increasingly, the impact it has on our political systems. And one of the problems that we're facing is that as business is perceived not to be fully in line with our interests as societies and communities around the world, it's placing increasing burdens on governments to sort out and clean up the mess that business leaves behind. And that's putting intolerable burdens on our political system as well.
it almost sounds, but we'll speak about it in a moment, if there is something like a fiduciary duty of businesses towards society, well beyond the private nature of fiduciary duty that you just alluded to. And I realized that in your book and these concepts that you develop, the topic of morality, ethics, if you will, play a big role before maybe even or in relation to the development of the legal system. In your mind, what moral concepts are important in order to lay the base for any potential improvements that you propose, and how would you apply those moral principles?
So there's one that I really refer to in particular in the book, which is the golden rule. I refer to the golden rule because in some respects, it's the most widely accepted moral principle around the world. It's part of virtually every religion in the world, though it's stated in a variety of different ways. And what I describe in the book is what I term a reformulated version of the moral law. The moral law says, do unto others as you would wish to be done unto you, which I criticize as being a rather self-reflective notion, looking at the rest of the world simply through one's own eyes. And I suggest that a reformulated version, which is sometimes known as the Platinum Rule, should be do unto others as they would be done unto them. In other words, look at the world through the eyes of those who you're affecting. Now, out of this, I derive what I term the moral law, which is a fundamental concept that underpins the ideas that I put forward in the book. And put simply, the moral law is profit without harm. That is to say, companies should be free to profit, but in the process of profiting, they should be sure to ensure that they're not profiting at the expense of others. And that is absolutely critical, not only in a moral sense of recognizing the duties that we have to others as individuals and societies and the natural world, but also because it's central to the functioning of our economic system. And the other point I make on the moral front in the book is that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is regularly referred to, but underpinning his Wealth of Nations is his prior book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that theory of moral sentiments, he puts forward very clearly a notion of morality that he thinks is critical. He describes it in terms of an impartial spectator. In essence, that impartial spectator acts as our conscience and overlooks the way in which we behave. And the reason why he emphasized that was because he thought it was a very important moral basis for our behavior. But also, it's then actually picked up, and this is not sufficiently recognized in the Wealth of Nations, in terms of the importance of justice and fairness, which is a key feature of the Wealth of Nations. And he argues that that notion of justice and fairness is a critical underpinning of his central concept, and that is the role of markets and competition in aligning our private interests with those of society. In other words, if we don't have something like a moral law of profit without harm, markets don't function. Competitive markets potentially make things worse because good firms are driven out by bad firms that don't incur the costs of ensuring that they don't profit without detriment. And therefore, we get runs to the bottom in competition, not runs to the top. So it's not just that this notion of morality is important in terms of some sense of fairness, but it's critical to the central proposition of a market economy, and that is the desirability of competition.
Fascinating. The thing that some companies would say, before we move on with the flow, but I pay corporate taxes. And so government, based on those tax revenues, should fix any other issues other than outside of the legal boundaries of the firm.
2 points on that. Point number one is, as we've seen, increasingly the tax burden that is being imposed on governments to address these consequential, what are sometimes termed externalities,
Yes.
companies, is proving unfinanceable. That countries' levels of debt are reaching points at which it's no longer possible for them to fund them simply out of raising tax revenues. And the second point is that, yes, taxation is potentially a very powerful tool for addressing precisely the problem that I'm talking about, if you recognize what that tax system should be doing. Because what I'm describing is that some companies are profiting in the sense of excess profits, profits that are earned from inflicting detriments on others as customers, employees, suppliers, or the natural world. And that those companies should then be subject to taxes, essentially an excess profit tax that redistributes those profits from those that are profiting at the expense of others to those that are trying to profit from actually incurring their true costs of avoiding detriments and cleaning up any mess that they're creating. So yes, the corporate tax system could be used as a very powerful instrument for underpinning exactly what I'm talking about.
I think it also leads to sort of a central theme in your, not only in this book, but also in previous work that we know of you, which is defining a corporate purpose. Now that you've sort of set the stage of what it is that a company should do or focus on, profit and not benefiting from cost produced somewhere else, how would you, and if I'm a little bit, how you say that, disrespectful, purpose almost sounds fashionable for some companies, but in your mind, it sounds to be necessary and also very well definable. In what way would you describe the purpose of the organization, and what will be, how can we implement that topic such that you get this new concept, not new, but this concept of profit so cleared out, if you will, in people's minds?
Okay. Well, let me just first of all say what does one mean by corporate purpose? Corporate purpose is the reason why a company is created, why it exists, its reason for being. So you said just now that it's becoming unfashionable, but it can be nothing other than absolutely essential. Because unless we're clear as to why a company is created and why it exists, we haven't really got any understanding as to what it's there to do. So understanding precisely what a corporate purpose is critically important. Now, the notion of why did we allow this freedom of incorporation to occur in the middle of the 19th century was that we thought that by doing that, it would unleash immense benefits to us as individuals. And let's be absolutely clear, it did. Now, since the creation of freedom to incorporate, we have enjoyed immense growth in prosperity, in incomes, in alleviation of poverty around the world. So the rate of progress associated with this has just been extraordinary. But we're also realizing that there's a growing problem that's emerging alongside all of that good outcome of incorporation. And that is that it's also associated with increasing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, social exclusion, inequality, and that mistrust that I mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
And we want to have the benefits without the detriment. So what we're really looking for is that companies have purposes where they solve problems that you and I face as individuals, as societies in the natural world. But there's a particular challenge that business has in doing that. It has to solve those problems in commercially viable and profitable ways. It's not charity.
Mm.
And therefore, one part of the notion of what a purpose is that it's about profitably solving problems of people and planet. But there's a second part which comes back to my moral law. Now, when I put forward that notion of a purpose of business in my second book, Prosperity, companies leapt on it, and corporate purpose went absolutely mainstream. Companies started adopting purposes left, right, and center. But what they were doing is essentially to use this as a great marketing and promotion tool to make them look good. And if that could help increase their profit, oh, well, that's even better. But what it leaves out is that there's a second part, which comes to back to that moral law. They should not profit from creating problems for others. So a purpose is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, not profiting from creating problems for others. And that then immediately defines what a profit is. Namely, a profit derives from solving, not creating problems for others. And that's, of course, what a profit should be. And that's what we think profits are. And people are outraged when they realize that actually companies are also profiting from creating detriments for others. Now, having made this point, then what's happened over the last few years, of course, is that there's been a backlash, which has been part of the woke capitalism and the anti-ESG movement and the purpose washing agenda. If companies simply treat it as a marketing and promotion campaign, it deserves to die because it's not actually reflecting what the real purpose of a business is. But now things are turning round again and moving very rapidly in precisely this direction. People now talk about it in relation to sustainability. And companies are really focused on what it takes for them to be sustainable businesses. Well, actually, at the heart of being a successful, sustainable business is to be a business with a purpose, a meaningful purpose of solving, not creating problems and profiting from doing that.
A legal purpose, maybe even?
Absolutely. So one of the key elements associated with this is that it should be recognized in corporate law that the nature of the purpose of a business is, yes, to create a successful business for the benefit of its members, its shareholders, as the UK Companies Act says, but to recognize that success means that the company is successful in terms of profiting for its investors, its members, through solving, not creating problems. So that notion of what, and most corporate law around the world, including in the United States, talks about fiduciary duties as being to promote the success of the corporation. That success needs to be recognized as reflecting the delivery of benefits, problem solving, as I'm putting it, not detriments for others.
So that sounds like a very high level of responsibility, and if I may say, maybe even ownership of ownership beyond ownership of the business into ownership of providing solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how we should be looking at ownership, that ownership of a company confers considerable rights, as indeed it should do, on the owners of the company, for example, to appoint, to replace directors, to express views on the remuneration of executives. But at the same time, it also imposes responsibilities. And those responsibilities derive from the fact that the owners are deriving substantial benefits, not just in terms of this notion of incorporation. And incorporation is an incredibly powerful legal tool of creating a separate entity, an entity that is distinct from simply the assets of those who are investing in it, but also that it's also creating an immense privilege and benefit in terms of limited liability, that those who invest in a company enjoy limited liability of the investments that they're making in the event of failures occurring in the business. Now, the corresponding obligation that imposes on owners is to ensure that the companies that they're investing in really are benefiting in terms of the profits that they create through earning those profits from delivering solutions to problems, not creating problems of an environmental, social, or individual customer and employee nature.
So does that mean that we, and this is a bit of a broad question because it depends also, I guess, a little bit on the legal system that people operate in. Do we need to come to a different understanding of fiduciary duties, or what would be a good definition of fiduciary duty that captures this, these notions?
Yes. So just to be clear, the notion of a fiduciary duty of a director at the moment is solely to the members of the corporation, the shareholders. And there are some people who suggest, well, that should be broadened to what is termed a stakeholder view of the firm, where the board, the directors are accountable not just to the shareholders, but to other stakeholders as well. Now, that's not the approach that I take in the book, because, as is sometimes said, being accountable to everyone is accountable to nobody. And it potentially introduces a lot of confusion into and complexity into the running of business. What I'm suggesting is a much more straightforward way of permitting that accountability to be retained by shareholders through simply aligning their interests in earning profit with those of other parties, the stakeholders to the firm. And that's precisely what the case, as soon as you pick up this moral law, as I'm describing, profit without detriment. Well, if you profit without detriment, then you're profiting from creating benefit. And companies can choose whatever purpose they like, provided they ensure they incur the costs of cleaning up the mess that they create and avoiding detriment in the first place.
Yes.
Now, we haven't actually talked of any examples yet, and so this might all sound rather disconnected with the real world. Let me just give one straightforward illustration of where people are at the moment outraged by the behavior of companies in Britain. I can talk about the post office as being one clear example, but let me talk about another one, water companies. Okay, water companies in the UK have been revealed to have profited, and their executives to have earned immense salaries on the back of companies that have been dumping raw sewage into our rivers, lakes, and seashores. And people are outraged. And here is one of the most regulated industries in Britain, apparently profiting immensely from not incurring the expenditures, the investment expenditures in particular, to ensure that they don't have to dump raw sewage into water systems, earning immense profits from not incurring those costs. Now, that is an illustration of where something has gone wrong in terms of fiduciary duties. And it's because the duty is not defined sufficiently clearly in relation to what success of the corporation means. Success does not mean earning money from dumping sewage. And in essence, what this is saying is there is a duty of care that directors owe as well to other parties. Their fiduciary duty should remain with their shareholders, but they should at the same time recognize the duty of care that they have to other parties that they affect and impact and depend on in terms of not imposing detriments on them.
Yeah. Somewhere in the book, you start also to speak about, I'm almost going to say the accountant's view versus the economist view. And one concept that you bring is the distinction between, on the one hand, inputs and outputs, and on the other hand, impact and outcomes.
Yeah.
Now, this is more than just wordplay,
Yes.
right? They're very fundamental, actually.
Yeah.
Can you elucidate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So what we do at the moment when we measure a profit and report a profit is we take the revenue that a company earns, we subtract off its costs in terms of its wage costs, its supply costs, its capital costs, etc. And that then gives us the profit of the business. But that is not the true costs. Why is it not the true cost? Because it doesn't take account of the impact that the company has on its employees in paying them below a living wage, on the people in their supply chains by paying them below a fair trade price, or the impact it has on the environment through pollution, emitting global warming gases, or causing biodiversity loss. And therefore, what is required is a very straightforward form of existing accounting approaches, what is termed cost accounting, that companies should incur the costs of avoiding those detriments, or where they have already caused them, ensuring that they clean up the problems that they have created, and that therefore their true costs reflect the costs that are currently measured, but also the costs associated with ensuring that, for example, they do pay living wages, they do pay fair trade prices to their suppliers, etc. And that then is the basis of accounting for what I term a just or a fair profit. And, in many respects, when companies sign off, or the directors sign off their accounts as being a true and fair representation of their financial condition, they're doing no such thing. It's neither true, because it doesn't reflect the true cost of the business.
Yes, yes.
And it's not fair, because therefore the profit that's reported is not a fair profit. Yeah. So this is just going back to basic accounting as to what we mean by a profit.
Yeah. It's so overseeing all this, what is the impact and what are the changes maybe that you would emphasize in terms of governance, both from a public perspective, and one can think about regulation and other forms of governance, and also in corporate perspective? What kind of impact do you project?
So let me be clear that at the moment, the way in which we try to address these issues is in terms of regarding the problem as being an externality. That's the phrase that economists bend around all the time, that it's external to business. It's about market failures. It's about failures of competition, of regulation, taxation, reputation, litigation, etc. But the point I'm making is this is not external or extrinsic to the firm. It's internal or intrinsic to the nature of business, and in particular, the core element, the fuel that drives business, namely profit. And that so long as we go on simply treating it as an externality, we're not going to solve the problem. I mean, of course, regulation is important, but regulation has serious problems associated with it. Companies lobby against it. They employ consultants to try to help them avoid it and possibly turn it to a competitive advantage. And in particular, as AI and various other forms of technological advances are taking place, regulation just simply cannot cope. Let me give you one example I was discussing recently, and that is an online safety act that the UK government is just introducing, in particular to protect child users of social media. And the impact, as you'll be aware, of social media on children has been, in some cases, absolutely devastating. That was first put forward in 2018. It was finally enacted in 2023, and it's now being basically implemented in 2024. So it's sort of a 6-year lag before it was recognized that it was needed. And, first of all, there's obviously been an immense amount of damage that's been done over that period. But secondly, that means that regulation is basically always massively behind the curve. So regulation doesn't do it. Competition, as I described earlier on, can be perverse because it rewards bad companies that don't incur costs of cleaning up the mess they're creating in relation to good companies that do. So it creates a sort of Gresham law of bad companies driving out the good. So, these standard responses simply aren't good enough. And we need to recognize that instead, the approach that we've got to take is to make the notion of profiting without detriment intrinsic to a company. Now, I've mentioned law, and I'm not going to say any more about it, but what is perhaps even more important is the governance of companies, the way in which companies are overseen by their boards and their investors, but also how they actually ensure an alignment of interests within the firm with the corporate purpose of solving, not creating problems for others. And that revolves around things like the culture of the organization, but also ensuring that there is delegated responsibility within a business, because no board of a company can itself know whether or not a company is causing detriments for others or solving problems for others. It's the people who are in contact with the communities, with the customers who are operating in the field. They see the impact that the company's activities, products, processes, etc., are having on others. And they need to be able to be put in a position of recognizing that it's their responsibility to ensure that the company's activities actually do reflect profiting from solving, not creating problems.
Yeah. In the book, you also speak about how finance and especially also capital allocation can be a force, hopefully for the good. In making investment decisions or in making capital allocation decisions, how would that play in to what you've just highlighted as being sort of the way forward?
Well, let me start off by making the obvious point that finance is absolutely critical in this area. The reason why, as I was saying earlier on, capitalism has been so successful in advancing prosperity and alleviating poverty around the world is the resources that it has available to it. And those resources derive from investment, financial investment, and capital markets around the world. So finance is potentially an incredibly powerful force for creating precisely the outcomes that we're seeking. Now, that is the case if the financial sector and financial institutions recognize that their responsibility is in terms of overseeing companies' investment and ensuring that those investments not only do what investors traditionally want them to do, to ensure that they are yielding a return in excess of the cost of capital for investors, but that return is associated with corporate purposes that are associated with profiting from benefit, not detriments. And therefore, it is part of the responsibility of investors as stewards of the companies in which they're investing and for their investor engagement with companies to ensure that they are quizzing companies and the boards of companies on the way in which they are determining their purposes, the extent to which those purposes are really being implemented in their businesses, the extent to which those problem-solving purposes are delivering financial returns for them, the investors. So as part of the investment analysis, and this is what we're increasingly seeing beginning to happen, institutional investors are now realizing that they have a key role to play in terms of promoting the notion of meaningful purposes that deliver greater benefits for investors as well as for the customers and societies and the environment as a whole.
Yeah, that's clear. Finally, before we go into Q&A, are the corporate directors, C-level leaders, and other leaders, are they equipped to make these changes? How far off are we from these changes in general, and also focused on leadership?
Well, the answer is that the education that we've been providing in, for example, our business schools in Oxford and Cambridge, as well as elsewhere, have only been partly appropriate for the task at hand. And that is because business schools everywhere have been schooled in this traditional notion of what the purpose of a business that derives from the Friedman Doctrine. Now, the Friedman Doctrine in terms of emphasizing profit is not, as I'm suggesting, wrong, but it's a question of where does that profit derive from? And that is the key issue that really should be at the heart of business school courses. And in particular, at the moment, basically business school courses still start off by saying, well, the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value, and everything follows from that: accounting, finance, marketing, strategy, etc. What we need is a program of education that starts from the proposition, what is the purpose of business? Why is it created? Why does it exist? What is it there to do? And then to consider the nature of a purpose of business that is in line with what is intended of business. And then everything in terms of the implementation, in terms of accounting, finance, strategy, marketing, etc., should follow from that. And that involves a significant shift in the way in which we structure our business education in business schools around the world. But increasingly, that is what business is demanding of business schools and looking for in terms of the people that they are producing as graduates of those business schools for potential employment and internships. So business schools are now finally beginning to respond to this agenda in terms of emphasizing the significance of these issues in a way in which has not been the case until very recently.
Before we turn to the Q&A, what did strike me over the last 45 minutes is that the word ESG has not really come up. Or Michael mentioned it briefly. That is actually almost maybe a telling feature Anything you want to mention on ESG?
Yes.
There's a big political debate in the US and so on.
Yes. No, ESG, and I'm glad it hasn't come up because it shouldn't have come up because it's been an incredible distraction from what's needed. And when it was first promoted, I warned at the time that there were serious problems associated with it in terms of consistency, in terms of the extent to which there was no correlation between the measures produced by different ESG providers and the fact that it's not a coherent concept. And let me just, I don't want to give a lecture on ESG at this point, but let me just make one very obvious point and problem with ESG. It's a confusion of cause and effect. Okay, the way in which ESG is now interpreted by most people is in terms of the impact and the risk that companies face from environmental and social factors on the performance of the company, the financial performance of companies. So it's increasingly being regarded as simply another risk factor of investors. And therefore, some of the initiatives we're seeing, for example, from the IFRS in terms of sustainability-related financial disclosures, and in particular climate-related financial disclosures, that is simply trying to provide investors with that type of ESG risk information. But that is very different from the reverse causality, namely the impact that companies have on their environments and societies. And that is sometimes described in terms of the intrinsic notion of ESG, or the double materiality notion, where one's saying that, well, one's also interested in that reverse causality. What's the impact that companies have on the environment and society? And that confusion has been one of the reasons why we've ended up with this greenwashing, quite justified greenwashing and woke capitalism reaction, because it looked as if, in essence, companies were responding by addressing people's concerns about environmental and social impact, when in fact, that's not what the ESG measure was doing at all. So it's been a terrible diversion from what is, as I just described, a much, much simpler approach that's needed. And that is simply to account for the costs that companies need to incur to earn a just or fair profit.
Which does have almost a systems implication. To come back to the systems approach, there's a lot that flows out of that. Let's say, even though it sounds simple, I think that we all can appreciate simplicity in solutions. Turning to Q&A, we still have some time for it. There is a first question in the chat. I would invite the person who asked this question, and
you're on mute.
You can unmute yourself. Please state your name quickly and where you're located and your core sort of business or professional interest before asking the question. Sona, can I invite you first?
Yeah, thanks, Erico. Thanks very much for all the insights you've shared. And my question was, you've perhaps already answered it in the context of education, but the proposition is business is there for the money. And I think it's like a quagmire, because at a personal level, yes, it's flawed trust, but collectively as a stakeholder via their pensions who are invested in those very same companies, and they sort of reap the dividend income. So it's a difficult circle to square, if you will. So the question is, how would you really align the morality and rights of all the stakeholders?
So, and thank you for raising that, Sonia. So what I'm putting forward is a notion that in essence, what is required is to recognize what good companies in any event regularly do in terms of the way in which they run their business. And that is to ensure that there is a flow of information in a company on the effect that that company is having on its customers. And clearly companies do worry about the impact that they have on their customers because it affects their revenues, but not just on their customers, but also on their employees, their suppliers, etc. And the reason why it's inherent to well-run companies, and they simply develop the internal management systems to do this effectively, is that they recognize that if they appreciate the effect and impact they're having on their employees, it gives rise to more engaged employers who support the corporate purpose in a more effective way. It gives rise to more reliable suppliers who then become a more trusted part of the company's activities. And in particular, it creates a better relationship between companies and their societies and the communities in which they operate, which then creates a reciprocal benefit for the company in terms of more supportive governments, for example, in relation to public procurement. Going forward, we're increasingly going to be seeing governments making decisions about public procurement on the basis of the extent to which companies are perceived to be reflecting the impact and the interests of the communities and societies in which they're operating. And that sort of reciprocal benefit makes it a natural way of management within successful businesses. So really what I'm talking about here is only something that, and I could, and I do in the book, illustrate it with many examples of companies that do this and how they do. What I'm really just talking about is good business practice that reflects the effect that companies have on others, not just their input costs and their output revenues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manjari. And I thank you also for coming online with video. You can ask your question.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
I'm Manjari Gupta. Hello. I'm a current student at George Business School. So I have a small venture which is just a few months old. So actually, I strongly resonate with your thoughts on ESG. It has taken a different turn. And regarding my startup, I run a startup which captures emissions of retail SMEs based on energy bills, and then we convert that to scores and enable retail customers to choose low carbon products.
Mhm.
So, how effective can this approach be as compared to pressure from regulators and investors? I'm talking about UK.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say that what you're doing is absolutely critically important and a central part of solving the problem. And I'm extremely optimistic about the future, largely because of the sort of thing that you're talking about there. And the reason why I'm very optimistic is that I think that technology offers the opportunity of implementing precisely what I'm talking about in a far more effective, low cost, and informative way than has been the case up until now. And let me just illustrate that in relation to a few areas, including one that you've just referred to. So one form of technology that's coming available is satellite technology, which allows one to observe the state and condition of nature around the world, almost to the level of individual leaves on trees. But not only does it increasingly allow one to determine the state and extent of natural capital, but also who is responsible in terms of the pollution that they're creating for a deterioration in the condition of nature in different parts of the world. The second example is in relation to social media, which I described earlier on as a bit of a mixed blessing in relation to at least protection for children. But one area where it potentially offers immense opportunities is in terms of providing informed feedback to companies, to executives, to the boards on the extent to which people's perceptions and views about their company as employees, as customers, as societies are positive or negative in relation to what the company is doing. And there'll be ways of auditing that information so that it's a reliable source of information, so that going forward, it's not just whistleblowers who are going to be relied on to inform companies, but that it will be a regular part, and increasingly it's becoming a regular part of companies informing themselves about the nature of their stakeholders' views on their corporate activities. And the third element is in relation to AI, which I think comes close to what you're talking about in terms of the potential for AI to process vast amounts of information, for example, in relation to the carbon content of different types of products, or the CO2 emissions associated with different types of energy providers. That sort of information is going to be accessible in a form in which people can really grasp and understand the nature of the impact that companies are having throughout their supply chains and on the environment, as well as on societies around the world. So what you're talking about is an illustration of what I think is a much broader development that's taking place, and hopefully will allow the emergence of many companies very similar to the ones that you're describing in terms of the way in which we're responding to the new technologies as ways of information provision on whether or not companies are really earning just and fair profits.
Yeah, Professor, thank you. That was very insightful. And we are progressing a lot. Lot of restaurants are coming to us. They speak about the new nature of customers. Customers ask, how sustainable are you? And they want a metrics, a certification kind of thing to choose the products. So this is coming up, and we are acquiring good number of service providers here in UK.
Brilliant. Well, I'm delighted to hear that. And I think you're absolutely right for the reasons that I was mentioning earlier on. This will create immense reciprocal benefits for companies in terms of the loyalty of customers to them, for example. Thank you.
Yes, Professor.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are also trying to tie up with Sainsbury and other supermarkets so they can sell products in eco-friendly packaging and all.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Very
Thank
good.
you, Professor. Thank you.
I still have more questions. So I know that Michael has a question, Sanchez, before Sharon. So Michael, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for that very insightful presentation. So you mentioned about the Friedman Doctrine, and this is one of the problems that we had, because it's during that time when this kind of a doctrine was adopted by the businesses, problems started to happen. But then I think I just want to pose this to you, that the doctrine will not fly if there was not a fundamental change in the moral values of people. So there must be something that predated or prepared its way to be accepted into society, and it could be like a moral, something like a moral change in what we have. So with that, if the change needs to be moral, then are we forgetting in the discussion two institutions that are important in the moral change of a society, which is, one is family, and the other one is possibly the church or religion? So because if we're advocating moral change, then it has to be coming from these institutions, just those things, would they be a factor in this change?
So yes, that is a moral element that clearly relates to many institutions beyond business. And the issue of how does one bring about the change in attitudes is clearly a critically important one. And one can discuss it in the context of, well, what is the way in which families teach their children, for example, or what is the role of religion? That provokes different responses on the part of people in terms of some who really believe that this is absolutely at the heart of the whole issue, and the others who sort of react by feeling, well, this is beginning to impose views that may not be acceptable to others. And in the past, we've obviously had a lot of concern about the divisions that religions have created, as well as the harmony. So one of the points that I emphasize is that in thinking about its particular application in this area, one doesn't necessarily have to go in that direction. One can start from what is a very general position of recognizing that what really underpins this moral framework is something that has a very wide degree of acceptance in terms of the nature of the principle of the golden rule. And just take that as a starting point for deriving something that I think virtually everyone can buy into or appreciates, that the notion of what derives from this is a very simple concept of profit without harm. It's in essence the equivalent of the Hippocratic oath in medicine, that one should do no harm. That's the equivalent that emerged as the Hippocratic oath. That cannot apply in business, because business does harm all the time in terms of making hard choice decisions. For example, in terms of closing down a plant in one area and starting it up in another, or retaining employees by raising prices to customers as against cutting prices and then having to lay people off. So it's making hard choices all of the time. But the basic notion that I'm putting forward as equivalent in the case of business is that, okay, companies may have to make hard choices, but they shouldn't be profiting from making those choices in a way that imposes detriments on some as against others. So it is a notion that I think everyone can readily grasp and understand. And as such, although it does have a moral underpinning, it's something that doesn't necessarily then have to say, well, you have to reform the whole of society in terms of religions, in terms of family teaching, etc. It's something that one can essentially think about implementing at the level of the corporation and business.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we're moving to Singapore. Sharon, you're in Singapore, right?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Ilko. So it's evening time. Thank you so much, Prof, for your insightful sharing. I'll keep my question quite short, given that there are many more that will come. So I am an alumni from CJBS, just graduated last year, and from Master of Finance program. So indeed, what you were saying about the business school teaching us about profit is all true, and we are all kind of like taught to be a bit greedy. I mean, I would use that word because in this case, I think that's what propels the profit-making motivation. So in this case, before that, I'm working in Save the Children, very ironically in that sense, but I'm totally aligned with the value, the moral framework, which is why I'm trying to align the two sometimes, but not successful yet at at some point, which is why I'm here to ask you my question. How would you suggest this education, the institutional level, how would you suggest bringing the grid so-called down, even from the academia perspective? Because if that's what is being perpetuated from the academic, like that will be continuing for a long time.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So Sharon, that's a very good question.
Thank you.
And the reason why I talk about it in relation to the profit of a business and not, for example, in relation to broader stakeholder concepts, is that I think one has to be realistic and recognize at the end of the day that profit is an incredibly powerful incentive and motive for people. And that whatever one might do in terms of trying to emphasize other moral issues, or as I was saying, in terms of regulation and competition, that at the end of the day, if one doesn't align that basic, not just incentive, but source of resources of business, namely profit, then one is simply not going to solve the problem. And I think once one puts it into those terms, what is then needed to address the problem becomes much clearer. It means, you can't play around on the side in terms of just looking to change some regulatory rules or even change taxes. One has to address head on this issue as to how is it that one incentivizes companies and people working in companies through the profit that they earn. And I think that then provides a much more straightforward way in which one can both develop the educational system and the policy making that's required to address this issue. Because it means that it implies that we need to, in essence, think about ensuring it's at the heart of the way in which we create a business. And as I said, a business is a legal fiction. It's something that is created by the law. And that form of incorporation is the basis on which the business operates. And it therefore has to be a central feature of the way in which we define the legal form of a corporation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From Singapore, we go to Washington, D.C., where we still have Roberto with a question. Roberto, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful discussion. I do want to push back slightly on the notion that business schools are teaching this idea of yearly profit. I think it was at Cambridge Judge that I learned more about B corporations, benefit corporations, and I'm lucky to hear people like Professor Chris Markey speak here in Washington, D.C. about such concepts. But I was curious about what the next wave or the next frontier of sustainability looks like, and I was wondering what sort of things need to change in order for businesses to take sustainability more seriously.
Okay, fine. Well, let me just answer that question by taking B Corp as an illustration. And I have to say, I think this is going to have to be the last question because actually I've got to go off shortly to another meeting. But B Corps are a tremendous initiative and have clearly grown in significance in terms of the number of B Corps around the world immensely, including particularly in the United States, but also in Britain and many other countries in Europe and elsewhere. They are predominantly, as you'll be aware, smaller businesses. The number of listed B Corps is still pretty small it hasn't really been able, despite attempts to do so, to impact large corporations because of the nature of the licensing or the evaluation procedure certification procedure is really complex to do for large corporations. But the main point I want to make about B Corps is, well, first of all, B Corps themselves are just certification mechanisms. Perhaps more significant than just B Corps is the legal form, the public benefit corporation, which is a feature of about 38 states now in the United States, and has been adopted in some countries such as Italy in Europe. But the feature of all of these is that they have not reformed mainstream corporate law, and therefore mainstream forms of incorporation. They are an option available to companies. And therefore, they don't address what I was describing as being a fundamental problem that arises in this area. And that is that companies like B Corps that want to do things correctly find it extremely difficult often, particularly as they grow to become larger corporations, to be able to compete against other firms that are not. And so at the end of the day, I think what is required is not that this should simply be an additional legal form that's available to companies, but that one has to think about these sorts of approaches as becoming part of mainstream corporate law around the world. And interestingly enough, there's just an initiative that's going through the Senate in Canada for a reform of federal law in Canada to do exactly that, which puts purpose as I'm defining it at the heart of it. So I think the B Corp movement and public benefit corporations are very desirable developments, but that they're not actually really the solution to the problem.
Thank you.
So there are more questions, I know, but for those answers, I would like to refer to this very readable book that we have been discussing, and more, of course, of your publication, Colin. With that, I turn over to Michael.
Thank you, Professor Mayer. That has been a very insightful discussion. So thank you for sharing those valuable insights. And we hope that after listening to this, we have not only provided you, the listeners, with some knowledge, but really galvanized you to become more positive contributors to this change. So thank you very much. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and bye for now.